Imagine walking into a modern appliance store today. You see rows of massive stainless steel refrigerators with digital screens and smart sensors. They hum quietly, wired directly to the power grid, promising to keep your food fresh forever. It looks like ultimate security. Now, imagine a storm rolls through tomorrow morning. A tree falls, a transformer blows, and the line snaps. Suddenly, that expensive metal box stops humming. It becomes a ticking clock. Within 48 hours, the expensive beef steaks, the chicken quarters, and the ground pork you spent good money on begin to turn soft, gray, and warm. You open the door, and the first sweet, heavy scent of ruin hits you. You have no way to stop it. Now, let me show you a different scene. Walk out behind the milk house on my farm. There stands a small, windowless building made of rough hemlock boards, weathered to a deep silver gray. That is my grandfather's smokehouse. Step inside, and your eyes adjust to the darkness. The air is thick with the scent of cold hickory smoke and cured fat. Hanging from a hand-forged iron hook on the rafter is a country ham. It is dry, dark, and firm to the touch. It has been hanging right there since the middle of November. It survived the winter freezes. It will hang there through the spring dampness, and it will remain perfectly safe through the heat of July. It does not need a single copper wire from the power company. And if the lights go out tomorrow morning, my family will eat just the same as we have eaten for 200 years in this county. My name is Elias Yodar. I am Amish, and I farm here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. My family has been butchering and putting up meat without electricity since long before the first refrigerator was ever invented. We don't do this as a survival trick. We do it because it is our normal way of living, and because the meat that comes out of that dark smokehouse tastes better than anything you could ever pull out of a plastic wrapper at a grocery store. Today, I want to share these traditional solutions with you. They work just as well, whether you live on a 100-acre homestead or in a suburban townhouse. Whether you are a hunter looking to preserve venison or a thrifty homemaker trying to do right by a sale on pork shoulder, this old knowledge belongs to you. But stop and think for a moment. Why do we rely so heavily on a fragile wire in the wall? How did our ancestors live for thousands of years without a cooling machine? The answers aren't lost. They were just quietly pushed aside when modern convenience arrived. There is no profit for the big grocery industries if you know how to keep a side of pork on a shelf for a year without their help. Understand this, though, before we go a single step further. This is the most honest word I will say to you today. Curing meat at home is real work, and it carries real consequences if you get careless. There is a toxin called botulism, a microscopic poison so severe that throughout history, improper food preservation has claimed lives. I will not have your name on that list. The methods I use are safe, but they require discipline. You must follow the tested recipes, respect the ratios, and walk before you run. A simple piece of dried beef jerky is very forgiving for a beginner. A whole country ham is not. We must respect the craft. Let us start at the very beginning with the grandfather of all preservation, salt. Long before there was an icebox, every culture on Earth discovered that salt could stop time for a piece of meat. The ancient Romans valued it so highly they paid their soldiers in white crystals. That is where our word celery comes from. It literally means salt money. The reason it works is simple chemistry. Spoilage bacteria, the tiny invisible organisms that cause meat to rot, need water to live. Salt, however, is incredibly thirsty. When you apply salt to a fresh cut of meat, it acts like a microscopic sponge. Through a process science calls osmotic pressure, which just means water moving towards salt. The crystals draw the internal moisture out of the meat cells. The surface begins to weep, shedding its juices. As the moisture leaves, the bacteria starve. They cannot multiply in a dry place. The meat changes from a vulnerable, perishable object into a stable, lasting food source. But here is the part where the modern internet often gets vague, and where the old farm journals are absolutely precise. You cannot just throw a handful of salt at a piece of meat and hope for the best. If you use too little, the center begins to spoil from the inside out. If you use too much, the meat becomes an inedible, salty rock. There is a specific golden ratio that has been tested by millions of hands before ours. For a traditional dry salt cure, you must use exactly 2.5% of salt by the weight of the meat. No more, no less. To put that into perspective, think of a standard 1-pound cut of meat, which is about 450 grams. You will need exactly 11 grams of salt, roughly 2 level teaspoons. If you have a 5-pound pork belly sitting on your table, that means you will need about 3 to 4 tablespoons of coarse salt to complete the cure. To soften the harsh, biting edge of the pure salt, we often add a small amount of sugar, about 0.5% to 1%. It doesn't sweeten the meat heavily. It just opens up the flavor, allowing the natural richness of the pork to come through. Imagine that fresh pork belly resting on a clean wooden bench right now. The skin is thick and pale, the fat is firm and stark white, and the ribbons of meat are a deep, healthy rose color. I have my small scale out, and I have weighed the salt and sugar mixture into a stoneware bowl. It feels coarse and cool between my fingers, like rough sand from a creek bed. I am about to show you the exact physical motion of rubbing this cure into the meat so it penetrates to the bone. How to pack it safely so air cannot pocket inside, and the unmistakable signs that tell you the salt has finished its invisible work and the meat is truly safe to hang. Imagine walking back to that wooden bench now. Bring the pork belly close to you. It should be cold to the touch, straight from a chilly pantry or your refrigerator. If the meat is warm, the fat turns slick, and grease blocks the salt from creeping inside. Look at it carefully. The muscle should be a clean, matte crimson, not shiny, and the fat should look like fresh winter snow, dense and unyielding. Run your palm over the skin side. It feels tough, like thick boot leather. Before we mix a single grain, understand this. Put away your measuring spoons. This is the first and most dangerous trap for the beginner. A tablespoon of fine table salt contains nearly twice as much actual salt as a tablespoon of flaky kosher salt. If you measure by the scoop, you are gambling with your health. We weigh everything on a simple scale, grams against grams. For this 5-pound slab, which weighs exactly 2,268 grams, we need 57 grams of coarse, non-iodized salt. To that, we add 22 grams of unrefined dark brown sugar. It smells of molasses, rich and earthy. Now, because this bacon will cure over more than just a few days, we introduce the protector I spoke of earlier, Prague Powder No. 1. It is a pale, dyed pink salt, soft as talc. We need just 5.5 grams. Do not skip it, and do not guess. When you blend these three together in your bowl, the white salt, the moist brown sugar, and the pink powder form a uniform sandy mixture that smells faintly sweet and sharply clean. Take a third of that mixture in your palm. Start with the flesh side of the pork belly. Rub it in with a firm circular motion. You will hear the rough grains scratching against the muscle, and within seconds, you will feel the meat begin to change. It gets sticky. That is the salt already pulling the first microscopic drops of moisture to the surface. Use your fingers to work the crystals into every hidden seam, every knife cut left by the butcher, and around the edges where the meat meets the fat. If you leave a single fold bare, a pocket of trapped air will invite spoilage. Turn the slab over and rub the remaining cure onto the skin side. It won't absorb as quickly through that leather hide, but the salt will find its way around the rim. Once the meat is completely coated, it will look frosted, like a window pane on a January morning. Now comes the containment. In the old days, we laid these slabs in long wooden boxes filled with salt, letting the juices drain through the cracks. Today, for a single piece in a modern kitchen, the cleanest and safest path is a simple, clear, sealable plastic bag or a deep stoneware crock. Place the belly inside carefully. Do not shake off the loose salt that didn't stick. Scrape every last grain from the bench and drop it into the bag with the meat. Seal it tight, pressing out as much air as you can with your hands. Take this package and place it in your cold spot. your refrigerator, or a dark corner of a true root cellar that stays strictly between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If the temperature drops below freezing, the curing stops completely because the water turns to ice and the salt cannot travel. If it rises above 40 degrees, the bacteria wake up before the salt can starve them. Temperature is your silent partner here. Keep it steady. Within 24 hours, you will look into that bag and see a change that frightens most beginners. The dry powder has vanished. In its place is a pool of dark, cloudy liquid. Stop and think before you panic. Your first instinct will be to open the bag and pour that liquid down the drain. Do not touch it. That is the natural moisture of the pig, drawn out by the thirst of the salt. It has dissolved the cure and formed a concentrated brine. That liquid is what carries the salt deep into the center of the muscle. Every single morning, for the next 7 days, you must walk to that cold spot, pick up the bag, and flip it over. Massage the liquid gently across the surface through the plastic. This ensures the brine distributes evenly and no part of the pork sits high and dry. By day 3, the color of the flesh will deepen from a rose pink to a dark cured burgundy, similar to the color of a mature beef roast. The fat will lose its stark whiteness and take on a slightly translucent, waxen appearance. On the 7th day, it is time for the test of the hand. Take the belly out of the bag. It will feel heavy and remarkably solid. When you try to bend the slab, it should no longer flop loosely like fresh meat. It should offer resistance, feeling firm and tight, like a well-inflated bicycle tire. Press your thumb hard into the thickest part of the muscle. When you lift your finger, the indentation should remain for a moment, slowly filling back in. If it feels soft or squishy in the center, seal it back up with its juices and give it 2 more days. The thickness of the cut determines the time. Once it passes the firmness test, carry the slab to the sink. Rinse it thoroughly under cold, running water. Wash away every remaining grain of salt and sugar from the crevices. If you don't, those surface crystals will dry into a white bitter crust that will ruin your first bite. Pat the meat completely dry with a clean, lint-free cloth. The meat is now cured, but it is not yet ready for the smokehouse. It needs to rest uncovered on a wire rack in your cold spot for 12 to 24 hours. As it sits in the dry air, a transformation happens on the surface. The moisture evaporates slightly, and the meat develops a thin, sticky, glossy skin that feels like dried shellac. The old-timers call this the pellicle. Understand this. The pellicle is the canvas upon which the smoke will paint. Without this sticky surface, the smoke cannot adhere correctly. It will simply slide off the meat, leaving a bitter, uneven flavor and a pale, mottled color. Only when that skin is dry and shiny are we ready to light the fire, select the wood, and step into the darkness of the smokehouse to finish the work. While our pork belly sits in the cold, waiting for its time in the smoke, let us pull back the curtain and look at the invisible world. To the eye, the meat seems to be doing nothing at all as it rests on the rack. But beneath the surface, a fierce, silent battle is being fought, governed by laws of nature that never change. The old folks did not have microscopes to see this battle, but they understood its rules perfectly because they saw the results year after year. To understand why salt behaves this way, you must understand what meat actually is. Fresh muscle is not a solid block. It is closer to a dense fabric woven from water and protein. In fact, fresh pork or beef is roughly 75% water. Now, stop and think about a fresh, damp sponge left on a warm kitchen counter. Within a couple of days, it begins to smell sour. That sourness is the sign of life. Millions of microscopic bacteria moving in to feast on the moisture. The very same thing happens to unprotected meat. The scientific principle that saves our bacon is something called osmotic pressure. Do not let the big name confuse you. The concept is as simple as a game of tug-of-war. Imagine every living cell, whether it is a cell of the pork muscle or a cell of a dangerous bacterium, as a tiny flexible water balloon. The skin of that balloon is porous. It allows water to pass through it. Under normal conditions, the water inside the cell and the water outside the cell are in balance. But when we rub those heavy grains of salt onto the surface of the meat, we completely disrupt that balance. Salt is incredibly greedy for moisture. It begins to dissolve in the small amount of dampness on the meat's surface, creating a highly concentrated boundary. Nature hates an imbalance, so it tries to dilute that heavy salt concentration. The water inside the meat cells immediately begins to rush outward to meet the salt. Now, think about what happens when a spoilage bacterium lands on that salted meat. The bacterium is also a tiny water balloon. Because the environment outside its little body is surrounded by salt, the water inside the bacterium is violently sucked out through its own skin. The tiny creature collapses, dries up, and either dies or goes into a deep, paralyzed sleep. It cannot eat, it cannot move, and most importantly, it cannot multiply. By applying that 2.5% salt ratio, you have effectively turned the rich, damp meat into a desert where life cannot take hold. Understand this, though. Plain white salt has a limitation when it comes to the deep interior of the muscle. This brings us to the science of that pale pink powder we added, sodium nitrite. While plain salt is excellent at stopping common rot and mold, it has a blind spot when it comes to Clostridium botulinum, the stubborn organism that causes botulism. This particular bug is different from common spoilage bacteria. It hates oxygen. It thrives in deep, dark, suffocating places, like the very center of a thick ham or inside a sealed jar. Even worse, it forms a protective shell called a spore. Think of these spores like tough desert seeds that can sit in the dry soil for years, waiting for the rain before they sprout. When plain salt moves slowly through a large piece of meat, it might take weeks to reach the center. In that dark, oxygen-free middle zone, before the salt arrives, those botulism seeds can wake up and produce a deadly toxin. This is where the sodium nitrite goes to work. When the pink salt comes into contact with the meat, it breaks down into a gas called nitric oxide. This gas travels much faster than the solid salt crystals. It floods the deep tissues and alters the environment, ensuring those dangerous spores can never open. As a beautiful side effect, that same nitric oxide bonds with the iron in the meat's natural pigments. Normally, when you cook or dry meat, the iron oxidizes and turns a dull, flat gray. The nitrite locks that iron in place, keeping the bacon a bright, beautiful mahogany and giving it that classic, sharp, cured flavor that reminds you of a traditional farmhouse breakfast. Now that we understand the why, we must look honestly at the boundaries of this method. No single traditional solution is a magic wand that works on everything, everywhere. Every old practitioner knows exactly where his craft stops working, and I am going to give you those hard limits right now. First, this dry salt curing method is strictly designed for dense, solid red meats and pork. It works beautifully on pork bellies, whole pork jowls, beef rounds, and dense wild game like venison or elk. It does not work safely on whole, bone-in poultry like chickens or turkeys if you try to dry cure them on a bench. Bird bones are hollow, and their joints are pockets of deep, trapped moisture that harbor entirely different types of aggressive bacteria. If you attempt to dry cure a whole chicken the way we just cured this pork belly, the interior joints will rot long before the salt can crawl through the dense skin and bone. Poultry requires a wet brine or immediate high heat, not a slow dry cure. Second, the method is entirely dependent on your raw materials. Salt is a preservative, not a medicine. It has the power to keep fresh meat fresh, but it does not have the power to make spoiled meat safe. If a piece of pork has sat on a warm counter for too long and has already begun to turn slick or develop a faint, sweet odor of decay, you cannot save it with salt. The bacteria have already produced their waste products and toxins. Throwing salt on it now will only preserve the rot. You must start with meat that is cold, clean, and fresh from the butcher. Third, look at the physical thickness of the cut. This dry rub method is perfect for pieces of meat that are under 3 or 4 inches thick, like our pork belly or a flank of beef. Why? because the salt can travel deep enough into the center within a few days to protect it. However, if you are a beginner and you attempt to cure a massive 25-pound fresh winter ham with the bone still inside using only a surface rub, you are inviting disaster. The salt travels through meat at a rate of roughly 1 inch per week in cold temperatures. By the time the salt walks 3 or 4 inches deep to reach the center bone of a massive ham, the marrow will have spoiled from the inside out. Large hams require advanced techniques, like pumping the brine directly into the veins with a needle, a skill you should only attempt after you have mastered the simple pieces. Finally, we must respect the boundary of air and moisture during the drying phase that follows the cure. If the air in your room is too dry or moving too fast, the outside of the meat will dry out instantly, forming a hard, leathery shell. The old-timers call this case hardening. It looks safe from the outside, but that hard shell acts like a stone wall, trapping the remaining water inside the center of the meat with no way to escape. That trapped moisture will quickly turn sour, ruining the entire cut from within. These are the real boundaries. They are not meant to frighten you. They are meant to ground you in reality. When you respect the limits of the salt, the temperature, and the meat, the danger disappears completely. Now that the science is clear, and our pork belly has finished its cold rest, the surface is perfectly sticky and primed. We are ready to open the heavy wooden door of the smokehouse, look at the hearth, and discover how to handle the oldest element of all, the fire. As we open the heavy wooden door of the smokehouse, a column of pale blue hickory smoke rolls out into the crisp morning air. It smells of old wood, sweet ash, and the deep richness of seasons past. We lift our cured, dried pork belly and hang it carefully from an iron S-hook on the lower joist, right beside the hams that have already taken on their dark, protective coat. I adjust the smoldering hardwood chunks over the small pit in the dirt floor, making sure there is no open flame, only a quiet, steady breathing of smoke. As I close the door and drop the wooden latch into place, we leave the meat to the final element, standing here in the quiet of the yard. Look at that small building, and stop and think about the lineage of hands that have performed these exact motions. This craft did not begin with my grandfather, nor did it begin with the first German settlers who arrived in Pennsylvania in the 1700s. We are participating in a human legacy that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization. If you dig into the historical records, you will find that the recipe we use today is almost identical to the instructions written down more than 2,000 years ago. In ancient Rome, a statesman named Cato the Elder wrote a book called De Agricultura around the year 160 before Christ. In the internal chapters of that ancient text, he laid out the exact steps for curing hams. He wrote about layering the meat in salt, pressing out the moisture, rinsing it, drying it in a cool wind, and then rubbing it with oil and smoke to protect it. For 20 centuries, the fundamental shield between mankind and winter starvation remained completely unchanged. It was the salt barrel and the smokehouse that allowed our ancestors to cross oceans, survive crop failures, and settle the wild frontiers of this country. Without preserved meat, the ships could not have sailed, and the winter cabins would have become tombs. As the years rolled into the 20th century, and modern machines began to change American farm life, the government realized that this traditional knowledge was beginning to fade, threatening the self-sufficiency of rural families. To prevent this loss, the United States Department of Agriculture began publishing official research guidelines to standardize these ancient practices for safety. If you look up the historical archives of the Government Print Office, you will find USDA Farmers Bulletin number 1186, originally issued in the year 1921, titled Pork on the Farm, Killing, Curing, and Canning. Inside those vintage pages, the government scientists did something beautiful. They took the traditional methods of the old farm butchers and verified them with modern laboratory science. They didn't change the recipes. They simply explained why they worked. They proved that the traditional farm ratio of 2.5 to 3% salt by weight was the precise biological threshold required to lower what modern food science calls water activity. University Research Extension offices, including our own Penn State Agricultural Extension, have spent decades analyzing these old-world dry cures. Their bulletins consistently demonstrate that when a dry cure is properly applied in a temperature-controlled environment under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the meat reaches a state of stability that prevents the growth of pathogenic organisms entirely. The modern laboratory merely put a scientific name on the wisdom that our grandfathers carried in their bones. But over the last several decades, a quiet shift occurred. The grocery stores filled up with massive refrigerated cases. The factories learned that they could inject meat with water, chemical preservatives, and artificial liquid smoke flavor using high-pressure needles. It allowed them to produce a package of bacon in 24 hours instead of 24 days. It was faster, it was cheaper for the factories, and it made the population completely dependent on a commercial food system that requires constant electricity to survive. The old knowledge wasn't disproven. It was just deliberately forgotten to make room for industrial profit. Understand this, though, that knowledge still belongs to you. It is a part of your heritage as a human being, and it is waiting to be reclaimed. You do not need to buy an expensive piece of land or build a massive log smokehouse to begin this journey. The laws of salt and science work exactly the same way on a kitchen counter in a crowded city as they do in my barnyard. I want to invite you to step across that line this very week. Do not let the scale of the old hams intimidate you. Start with the simplest, most accessible step. Go to your local market, buy 2 pounds of lean beef or venison, and cut it into thin strips. Weigh out your salt and your spices according to a tested, simple recipe for jerky. Dry it slowly in a standard kitchen oven, set to its lowest temperature, ensuring it reaches that safe internal mark of 160 degrees within the first hour. And let it dry until it is leathery and firm. When you take that first piece of meat out of the jar weeks later, look at it carefully. Realize that it is completely shelf-stable. Realize that it will not spoil if the power grid fails, and that it requires no freezer, no wires, and no corporate supply chain to keep it safe. When you taste that deep, clean flavor, a flavor achieved entirely through your own hands and the simple physics of salt, a small window will open in your mind. The mystery and the fear of traditional preservation will vanish, and you will understand that you are no longer entirely helpless. Tell me in the comments below if you are willing to take that first step with me. Tell me if you remember the smell of a grandfather's cellar or a grandmother's pantry, because those memories are the very seeds we are trying to replant today. I read every single story you share. Our pork belly is safely in the smoke now, beginning its slow transformation into a slab of bacon that will last for months. My workout here for the morning is finished. Until next time, when we will stand together by the iron kettle and learn the clean, beautiful craft of rendering lard, I leave you with this thought. Get